Jordan Beach will be talking about the independence of Poland.
Poland scored a 60 on being an individualistic society. They have a preference to have a loosely knit community, which means they feel the need to take care of themselves and their intermediate family members only, so their moms, dads, brothers, and sisters, but they do not feel the need to reach out to their cousins and take care of their cousins or their neighbors or friends and other family members. They only feel the need to care for themselves and intermediate families. This does lead to some delicate relationships, but they are intense relationships. Poland also scores a high on masculinity and a low on femininity. This shows that the masculinity drives the country to being competitive and have high success rates and achievements. This value system really starts in the school and continues throughout their lifetime. The fundamental issue here that they run into is masculinity is what motivates their people to wanting to be the best, but not what they like to do. So the masculinity forces them to be successful and wanting to be the best that there is, but in the femininity, they don't exactly enjoy what they are doing. Poland also scores a 68 in power distance. Power distance is defined as the extent to which the less powerful members of the institutions and organizations within the country accept that power isn't distributed equally. So since they scored a 68, it means Poland is a hierarchical society, which means that they accept that everyone has a place and that there is no further justification needed. That kind of goes along with the masculinity and femininity in the culture. So this also contributes to the strain of the culture because not everyone is equal, and in Poland they like to have a loose social framework. They don't feel the need to take care of community members and their neighbors around them as long as their family is good.
Continuing with Jordan, she will mention analytical thinking.
Analytical thinking, individualism. So analytical thinking is characterized by focusing on objects and their attributions. Objects are perceived as existing independently from their context, and they are understood in terms of component parts. Analytical thinking is most common in Western and Central cultures. Poland does practice individualism, which means they think more analytically. They tend to see objects independently from their context around them. This is due to their power distance scores, their masculinity and femininity, and seeing that everyone has their own hierarchical order in place that they are in society with no other further justification towards it. This teaches that Poland perceive their variabilities and dependencies from their current state of knowledge. Which goes back to analytical thinking, as that they view things in parts and independently and not as a whole. So in their society, they focus on their family and making sure that they are taken care of and they have stable jobs, stable mental health. They are fully stable and they only focus on the moving parts of their family intermediately and not their group as a whole. And they don't feel the need to take care of the community and so This is due to the fact that they are an independent culture and they strive on independence instead of as a group. So versus holistic thinking, where they do view objects in a whole picture because they, as a society, work as a whole and as a group. Poland does not work as a whole. They work independently and they strive on individualism, which is why they think analytically.
Further on, Wes is going to talk about individualism and collectivism.
What is an individualistic culture? We know that culture is one factor that can have an influence on people, how they think and behave. One factor that cross cultural psychologists often study is one of the differences and similarities between an individualistic culture and a collectivistic culture. We know that individualistic cultures are those that stress the needs of the individual over the needs of the group as a whole. In this type of culture, people often are seen as independent or autonomous. The social behavior in their cultures tends to be dictated by the attitudes and preferences of those individuals specifically. Cultures such as in North America and Canada and US of those, and western parts of Europe tend to be more individualistic. Poland happens to be in that Western Europe region as well. Traits of individualistic cultures that they will display, such as self-reliant, high value on independence, and greater emphasis on standing out or being unique. Being dependent on others seems to be more seen as shameful in those cultures as well, or embarrassing. But people are expected to solve these problems or accomplish their goals all on their own, which is what that high independence is coming from. An example of this in the workplace for an individualistic culture is a worker will be more likely to put value on their own well being over the goal or good of their group or company. An interesting comparison between these two cultures is that people will have self concepts that are more focused on independence rather than interdependence. So, the way the individualistic societies have a difference in behavior will compare to the collectivistic cultures, as people have the self concepts that are more focused on describing themselves in terms of their own characteristics, which is not how the collectivistic cultures will be. But Poland's culture will be individualistic, which is according to Gert Hastide culture dimensions theory. And in that theory, they scored a 60 on that dimensions, which through the research says that that is a very high score when you are being an individualistic culture. And collectivistic, just to give you a comparison, a collectivistic culture would emphasize the needs and goals of the group as well over the needs and desires of a specific individual, which is completely contrary to what we talked about for the individualistic. In such cultures, relationships with other members of this group, have a interconnectedness between the people and that controls that person's identity more than it would how an individualistic culture would have their own characteristics as their identity. In Poland, an individualistic culture, like we talked about from Gert Hastide, this dimensions theory shows that the degree of independence within a society, and since Poland scored pretty high, this shows you that they fit well with that description of being individualistic, as well as how we talked about with the Western regions. In these individualistic cultures, there is an I mentality, and there's an emphasis being placed on their self. In addition to this, there is also an expectation that people should be able to take care of themselves. A society like this, very similar to society in the US, like we discussed, as they live in an individualistic society compared to an Eastern Asian country, that in line a collectivistic culture, and the place of the emphasis on the interdependence and the communal relationship shows the complete opposites of each other.
Continuing on with Wes, talking about proximal and distal cases.
Proximal is something that changes that are those of a direct or immediate effect, and a distal case is something that changes over a long period of time. So, a valid understanding of relationships between cultures and a person requires an adequate conceptualization of many contexts with which individuals work and live. These these are more distal features of an individual's birth ecology and ethno-national group history. So, these factors converge more proximally upon an individual's experience as a process, variables through the institution's normative constraints and affordedness encountered through the socialization that a diverse set of culture groupings can entail. This enculturation is then revealed in an individual's response of profile values, beliefs, choices, and behaviors at any given time. So, an individual will become less dependent on clothes for survival and better be able to survive in greater agency in choosing his or her proximal cultural groupings and microculturals of relationships between proximal cultures. These emergent structures finally channel an individual's choices, skills, enhancements, and leading to an individual's personality's development. So, with a more recent proximal change that has not happened like other cultures have is from the EU Parliament that have an issue with Poland's de facto criminalization of sexual education, as well as hate speech and public discrimination, violence against women, domestic violence, and intolerant behaviors against minorities and other vulnerable groups such as the LGBTQ. And this was an issue that EU Parliament raised, showing that Poland's culture has not changed over time, such as those as the Western regions that they were also compared with, that have the same quote-unquote individualistic culture. But you can see that the distal changes did not happen over time. That this culture still has not given the changes that treat other people with more equality, like the ones that were compared with them. Also, because of the rapid industrialization and urbanization, as well as the certain trust of the rural conservatism during the years of the communist rule, Poland's traditional folk culture has been seriously undermined since World War II, showing a distal change in a whole culture. An example of these folk tradition changes is their regional dress, dialects, speech, peasant art, religious and folk festivals, all have been swamped by mass cultures that are either from the bigger cities surrounding them and or from the media influence. And why that is important is the proximal and distal changes that happened after World War II not only undermined all of their traditions that were passed down from many generations, but it all happened because that culture, Poland, like others, all wanted to fit in with what the fad or big thing was. And after World War II, we had the 60s and the 70s and different cultures which were big in their own way. And even now, with the added media representation, you can see why those younger individuals in Poland may not want to be part of the old traditions anymore. And some of their major holidays as well that used to be more peasantry have now been overtaken by the Christian in nature, which we know, or you should know, that Poland is what used to be very Catholic, and other changes that may commemorate a national building and or thing like Constitution Day. But you can see that Poland was just as susceptible as other cultures with the changes that we see America having as well.
Jordan Beach will be now talking of variations of love.
When it comes to variations of love in Polish culture, the types of love, these include searching for love, seeking love, finding love, and looking for love. Usually, attraction happens first for two people, and from that initial attraction, a connection and familiarity can be built. At weddings, the bride and groom are greeted with bread and salt, and these items represent the essentials of life in Polish culture. It is expected that men and women get married in their early 20s, and it was very discouraged that couples live together before they are married. In the 1990s, people were marrying very young, and it was customary that the newlyweds would live with family for the first few years, and these families would financially support that couple. Today, however, people are waiting to get married until they are between the ages of 25 and 29, meaning that they are more educated than if they were to be married at the age of 20. Being more educated and older also makes these couples more financially free and more likely to pay for their weddings themselves and break traditions that the parents might have paid for in that traditional wedding setting. People in Poland are also expected to only marry one time and have children with their spouse right away. Formal divorces in the Polish culture were often very, very difficult to obtain and were often seen happening by one of the spouses leaving and not coming back. It often did not matter if the couple was happy or in love with their spouse. The Polish believed that it is better to be married than nothing, as their saying goes. It was thought that people that never married in their lives were never truly happy and would have difficulty obtaining salvation. The Polish culture often viewed marriage as a holy responsibility rather than a commitment for love. Polish communities, while they are similar to other Western European countries, tend to be more conservative when it comes to their romantic relationships. Polish weddings were traditionally large-scale events taking place over the course of 2 or 3 days with an abundance of food, alcohol, traditions, and hundreds of guests. Today, however, because many young adults are waiting to get married and fronting the money for the weddings themselves, they are straying away from the traditions that their parents would pay and push for typically. The traditional wedding settings were often in rural environments, and with the urbanization of different countries and those environments, it is more likely for young adults to wait to get married and put the money down themselves, and no longer following those rural traditions. When it comes to cultural display of rules in the Polish community, in Poland it is more on the stoic side of the certain things. For example, there is a norm of negativity for most of the population. This happens when they associate the perception of the world being evil or negative. A couple of other examples are that older women are respected much more. It is desired to be direct and stern in conversations, and If you were to be shy and not converse with others, it was a sign of a weak personality. People were typically never late, and if you were late, it was a sign of bad manners, and it was often considered very rude. As well as being loud or over-exaggerating certain things is another sign to the Polish community that you have bad manners or are rude. According to the article, cultural display rules of smiling and personal well-being, mutually reinforcing or compensatory phenomena, Polish-Canadian comparisons, written by Daniela Heiker and Saba Safdar and others. The norm of negativity is associated with the perception of the social world as basically evil. People are not trustworthy, vice is salient, and the social order is unjust and unfair. This negativity also leads to perceptions that one is a victim of evil social institutions and people.
My name is Sophie, and I'll be talking about culture displays and rules. Looking more into the culture display of the Polish side of culture, it's more stoic for certain things. For example, there's a norm of negativity for most of the population. This occurs when they associate with the perception of the world being evil or negative. This happened during the war times that would happen there near them and in the country for themselves. Older women are actually respected more. It actually is known to be more direct and stern conversations. This shows that you're not shy and you don't converse if you're not stern. It shows that you're weak personality. As well as to never be late. It shows a sign of bad manners and it's very, very rude. Especially being loud or over exaggerated is considered bad manners as well. For looking over the ethnic perspectives in Polish cultures, understanding their norms and traditional without being obstructive or judgmental, such as observing the interactions between each person in that specific culture. Looking to the ethnic approach in Polish cultures of comparing theirs to surrounding culture, for example, as Russian culture, seeing the varieties of differences as well as similarities, such as comparing marriage traditions, what type of food they eat, comparing holidays, social norm standards, and even to the celebrations they have.